Imagine reaching the age you've spent decades planning for, and opening a statement to find your retirement savings nearly gone. Every careful investment, every paycheck saved, every sacrifice made, unraveling faster than anyone expected. What if the life you dreamed of, security, independence, calm days, was slipping through your fingers, not in a dramatic crash, but quietly, imperceptibly, until it's too late? Beneath the surface, unseen forces are at work, markets shifting overnight, healthcare costs climbing beyond projections, interest rates faltering, invisible currents that eat away at stability. Small anomalies, an unexpected downturn, a failing company, a spike in inflation, can ripple across decades of careful planning, imperceptibly eroding wealth. What if these weren't isolated incidents, but signs of a system quietly stacked against long-term security? Across the country, Americans face this reality. Data shows many retirees rely on partial pensions or dwindling savings, believing they are safe, only to discover that certainty was an illusion. The stakes are enormous. Freedom, dignity, the ability to live without fear, can all vanish in a matter of years. This story follows the Harrisons, a single family navigating decades of triumphs, setbacks, and hidden economic pressures. Through their lives, we trace patterns, uncover mistakes, and confront consequences that could happen to any household, and reveal choices that determine survival or collapse. If you've ever wondered whether your nest egg is truly safe, their story will make you look twice at what you think is secure, and what can quietly, relentlessly, slip away. The Harrison house stood at the corner of Maplewood Avenue in suburban Ohio, its white siding glowing faintly in the early morning light. 1952, the air smelled of fresh-cut grass and coal smoke from the nearby factory chimneys. William Harrison, 28, adjusted his tie, brushing his fingers over the smooth fabric, feeling the weight of the day ahead. Today wasn't just another Monday, it was the start of something that would define the rest of his life. William had married Margaret 2 years earlier, a schoolteacher with a quiet smile and a resolute spirit. They were young, ambitious, and tethered to a post-war America that promised opportunity for those willing to work, save, and plan. The nation had emerged from the shadows of conflict, its factories humming, its middle class expanding, its optimism almost palpable. But beneath that optimism, subtle currents were shifting, unnoticed inflation, the first murmurs of a changing economy, a society on the brink of consumer revolution. In the kitchen, Margaret placed a tray of toast on the table. Their son, Tommy, 7, was already scribbling numbers in a notebook, imagining he was balancing his father's ledger. "One day, Dad," he said, eyes shining, "I'll make sure we never run out of money." William laughed, ruffling his hair, hiding the pang of anxiety he felt whenever he thought about the future. Saving for retirement seemed distant, almost abstract, a puzzle without urgency in a world that was always rushing forward. William walked to the factory that morning, passing neighbors and street vendors, each step marking a rhythm of post-war life, jobs, mortgages, school lunches, street baseball. The factory itself was a cathedral of machinery, steel beams, conveyor belts, the hiss of steam. Jobs were plentiful, unions were gaining ground, and there was talk of pensions, though few understood the implications. For the Harrisons, this was security, or so they believed. The first decade of their life together was marked by careful calculations. Every paycheck was divided, living expenses, emergency savings, a small amount into the local credit union, and a growing deposit into a fledgling pension plan offered by the factory. They weren't wealthy, but they weren't struggling either. They attended PTA meetings, church picnics, and baseball games. Margaret kept a meticulous household ledger, William studied stock tickers in the Sunday newspaper. Yet even as they measured and planned, subtle cracks were forming, rising housing costs, new tax policies, and an economy increasingly tied to volatile markets. In 1960, when Tommy was 15, William received a promotion. It came with a modest salary increase and, crucially, a better pension plan. The announcement should have brought relief, yet something gnawed at him, a vague unease he couldn't name. Economists of the era had begun noticing early signs of inflation creeping into wages and prices, but few families felt the threat personally. For William, the abstract numbers in the Wall Street Journal felt distant, almost irrelevant, until one evening he opened the family ledger and realized their safe savings might not outlast a decade if the patterns shifted unexpectedly. Margaret noticed his worry, but she did not question it aloud. She focused on the household, on keeping Tommy grounded, on securing a home that would shelter them not just from weather, but from uncertainty. By the late 1960s, the Harrisons had bought a second car, a modest vacation cabin in Michigan, and were planning college for Tommy. On the surface, they were thriving, emblematic of the post-war dream, a nuclear family, rising income, a house with a white picket fence. Yet every small success carried hidden tension. The stock market was volatile, the industrial base slowly shifting, and the cost of healthcare, largely unmonitored, was quietly creeping upward. In 1973, the first shock hit. Oil prices quadrupled almost overnight. Inflation surged. Factories laid off workers. William's pension, designed in a more stable economy, began to show signs of strain. The couple faced the first real test of their financial planning. It was subtle at first, slightly higher grocery bills, modestly increased utility costs, but the worry took root. William stayed late at the factory, working overtime, calculating what small sacrifices could shield their family from these invisible pressures. Meanwhile, Margaret found herself negotiating with mortgage lenders to adjust their interest rates, protecting the home they had painstakingly purchased. Tommy, now 25, had moved to Chicago for a job in finance, carrying with him the lessons of meticulous saving from his parents. He wrote home frequently, sending letters filled with excitement over new investments, mutual funds, and emerging markets. The world seemed bigger, faster, and more volatile than his parents' hometown. "Dad, you have to consider inflation-adjusted returns," he wrote in one letter. "The world isn't as predictable as we thought." William read it carefully, feeling both pride and a subtle anxiety he could not articulate. By the early 1980s, the Harrisons had weathered several economic storms. Recessions, rising taxes, volatile markets, they had seen it all. Yet the quiet erosion of their savings continued, nearly imperceptible, masked by promotions, bonuses, and minor windfalls. They still believed in the system, trusted the advice of experts, and relied on the perceived stability of pensions and Social Security. It was only later, when reviewing decades of financial statements, that they would realize how fragile the foundation truly was. Margaret, ever observant, began keeping scrapbooks of receipts, statements, and notes. "We can't control the market," she said one afternoon, arranging pages chronologically, "but we can see the patterns, maybe we can learn from them." Her words were calm, measured, but they carried the weight of someone sensing an approaching storm. The family lived in the rhythm of daily life, yet beneath each chore, each dinner conversation, each bill paid, the shadow of uncertainty grew. One evening, in 1985, William found himself alone in the study. He spread out decades of ledgers, charts, and letters from Tommy. The numbers, once comforting, now created a mosaic of quiet instability. Inflation had averaged higher than anticipated for 20 years. The pension fund, solid in theory, faced mounting obligations and uncertain returns. Healthcare costs, minor at first, had grown disproportionately. His gaze fell on a small line item, projected shortfall, 2030, $45,000. A number he had never imagined seeing, yet it was real. The sound of the clock ticking in the empty house seemed unusually loud. Each tick measured not just time, but potential risk, the erosion of years of careful planning. He could hear the distant hum of traffic outside, the murmur of neighbors in their homes, the normalcy of life continuing elsewhere. And yet, in that moment, William felt the quiet, crushing weight of an invisible threat, a danger not immediate, but inexorable, something that could unravel the world he had built for his family. He stared at the papers, tracing the columns with trembling fingers, and thought of Margaret, still in the kitchen humming a tune, and Tommy, working in a city that moved faster than they could. Could decades of careful saving survive the forces now clearly at work? Or had they been lulled into a false sense of security by the routine of life, blind to the shifting currents beneath? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, carrying a chill that had nothing to do with the season. And in that chill, a question whispered, one that would shape the next generation, one that would ripple through time, one that William could not yet answer. If the foundations were weaker than they seemed, how long before the entire structure collapsed? The papers lay scattered across the desk, the numbers staring back, insistent, undeniable, and in the silence of that Ohio night, William understood that the security he had always believed in might be slipping away, faster than he could stop it. The camera lingers on the ledger, the projected shortfall glaring like a warning. Outside, distant sirens echo, a world moving forward oblivious to the slow unraveling of a family's carefully built future. William closes his eyes for a moment, the weight of decades pressing down, and then, a letter slides through the mailbox, unmarked, bearing news that could change everything. The letter rested on the hallway table, its envelope yellowed and slightly brittle, as if it had been waiting years to be opened. William hesitated, his fingers brushing the paper, sensing an unusual weight in the ordinary. Margaret's humming drifted from the kitchen, comforting yet unaware of the tension tightening the air. The address was printed formally, a government seal faintly embossed, pension office, notice of adjustments, nothing alarming at first glance, until he unfolded the letter and read the first lines. Projected shortfall, they wrote, not an estimate, not a possibility, a revised calculation. The pension that had seemed secure for decades now faced an undeniable gap. Changes in interest rates, shifting fund allocations, unforeseen liabilities, decades of compounded assumptions had led to a simple, chilling truth: the Harrisons' retirement plan, their safety net, could run dry years sooner than anyone had imagined. Margaret appeared behind him, eyes curious. "William?" He handed her the letter, his hands trembling. They read it together, the room quiet except for the faint ticking of the old mantel clock. Words that once would have seemed like bureaucratic formality now carried a weight that pressed against their ribs. Numbers that had been abstract, safe, theoretical, now had faces, dates, consequences. Outside, 1985 America hummed with its own momentum. Reaganomics had reshaped the economy, tax cuts, deregulation, and volatile markets rippling through the stock exchange. Families like the Harrisons had believed in gradual growth, stability, pensions, and government oversight. Yet subtle systemic shifts, stagflation of the 1970s, industrial decline, energy crises, had begun eroding what once seemed immutable. And now, that erosion was personal. Tommy's letters from Chicago echoed in William's mind. "Adjust for inflation, Dad, the world isn't as predictable." William had nodded when reading them months before, placing the advice alongside other calculations. Now, the advice felt prophetic. The reality was no longer abstract. They spent the evening poring over spreadsheets, notes, old statements. Margaret kept meticulous calculations, scribbling margins in pencil. The couple realized the shortfall wasn't small, it wasn't a problem solvable with minor sacrifices or temporary measures. It was structural. The pension's growth assumptions had been too optimistic. Social Security, while reliable, would cover only part of their future expenses. Healthcare costs, once predictable, were climbing at a rate that outpaced inflation. By nightfall, William sat in the living room, staring at the glow of a single lamp, the letter open on his lap. He pictured Tommy, decades younger, playing in the yard. Could the lessons of saving and planning have been enough if the underlying system was flawed? Could any amount of prudence truly protect a family against the unseen forces of a changing economy? Margaret joined him, her hand brushing his shoulder. "We'll figure this out," she said softly. Her voice carried resolve, but William knew that determination alone couldn't alter market forces, inflation rates, or shifting policies. He nodded, silent. There were no easy answers, only decisions with long shadows. In the following weeks, the Harrisons adjusted. William took overtime shifts at the factory, Margaret picked up private tutoring in the evenings. They delayed minor home repairs, canceled planned vacations, and scrutinized every expense. The adjustments were painstaking but necessary. Yet even as they controlled the immediate, the larger forces, national recessions, volatile bond markets, energy crises, remained beyond their influence. Meanwhile, Tommy's career in finance flourished, yet he grew increasingly aware of the fragility his parents now faced. Chicago, with its high-rise offices and bustling trading floors, was a world of rapid calculations and constant volatility. Investments could rise and fall in hours, markets reacting to political speeches, oil futures, or sudden economic indicators. Tommy's understanding of risk deepened, and he began writing home with a new urgency, warning his parents about economic trends, advising diversification, and emphasizing liquidity. By 1987, the economy had begun showing its teeth. The stock market crashed that year, Black Monday, sent shockwaves across portfolios nationwide. For many, it was a temporary panic. For the Harrisons, it became a tangible demonstration that assumptions, no matter how carefully made, could fail catastrophically. William's pension fund, tied to equities and bonds, dropped noticeably in value. The shortfall calculated in 1985 was no longer hypothetical, it was real and growing. Margaret's quiet resolve became their anchor. She began keeping a binder of historical economic data, cross-referencing it with their personal financial statements. Charts of inflation, healthcare trends, stock performance, all meticulously annotated, formed a tapestry of both warning and understanding. The couple realized they were living history, participants in patterns that had shaped decades: post-war prosperity, industrial decline, policy shifts, and market volatility. They were not isolated, they were part of a systemic story, and their personal struggle mirrored a broader societal challenge. Yet even as they adjusted, uncertainty lingered. Every decision carried consequences. Delaying medical checkups, taking on extra work, cutting small comforts, it all added to stress. The weight of decades of preparation, once a source of pride, now pressed heavily. William often woke at night, staring at the ceiling, thinking of numbers that no one else could see, numbers that predicted scarcity and discomfort years ahead. One evening, in late 1988, the Harrisons received another letter. It wasn't from the pension office this time, but from a financial advisor connected to Tommy. "We need to talk about the real exposure," it read. The message was succinct, but loaded with implication. The problems weren't small, and they weren't isolated. Market fluctuations, fund allocations, inflation, and the hidden liabilities of decades-old policies converged to create a risk that could no longer be ignored. William and Margaret sat together, the letter between them. Outside, the wind rattled the maple trees lining the street, leaves falling like scattered notes of warning. Their house, once a haven, now seemed fragile in the shadow of economic reality. The weight of uncertainty, once abstract, was now tangible. Each calculation, each projection, seemed to demand immediate attention, yet none offered comfort. The Harrisons decided to act. They met with advisors, restructured parts of the pension, began liquidating small assets, and created contingency plans for unforeseen emergencies. The adjustments required sacrifice, patience, and a growing understanding of risk. Each action was a response to forces they could not control: markets, policies, inflation, yet necessary to protect the life they had built. As the 1990s approached, the family faced a new challenge: their children. Tommy had married, had a son, and began asking questions about his own future security. The lessons he learned from his parents, careful saving, meticulous planning, attention to risk, were now under stress. How could one generation ensure stability when the very system designed to protect them was showing cracks? One night, William sat alone in the study, surrounded by ledgers and letters, staring at the numbers that refused to settle. The glow of the desk lamp illuminated the careful notes Margaret had kept, each margin filled with insight and worry. And then, he noticed something, a small discrepancy, buried in decades of accounting, that hinted at a larger problem. Not a minor miscalculation, not an oversight, but a structural flaw in the pension system itself. If left unchecked, it could unravel everything, faster than they could adapt. The realization hit with the subtlety of a shadow. They had been managing immediate crises, addressing surface-level problems, but the deeper currents remained hidden. Forces decades in the making, policy decisions, market behaviors, demographic shifts, loomed beyond their control. And for the first time, William understood that their fight for security was not merely personal. It was part of a story millions of Americans were living, quietly, invisibly, year by year. He rose from the desk, moving toward the window, and looked out over the quiet street. Lights glimmered in the houses across Maplewood Avenue. Families slept unaware of the slow erosion of security, the unseen currents that could upend lives in ways that seemed impossible, until it was too late. And then, a phone call shattered the stillness. The voice on the other end was unfamiliar, urgent. "Mr. Harrison, we need to discuss your pension immediately. There's been a development, something that changes everything." William froze, the receiver trembling in his hand. Outside, the wind carried a sharper edge, rattling the windows, whispering that the calm of decades might have been an illusion, and that the storm was arriving faster than anyone could have predicted. The screen lingers on William's face, the phone pressed to his ear, eyes widening. The camera pans to the pension ledgers, numbers sprawled across decades, now glowing ominously in the lamplight. The unseen forces, the markets, the policies, the slow erosion of security, were no longer distant threats. They had arrived. And whatever the voice on the other end was about to say, would change the Harrison family's life forever. The phone call lingered in William's mind long after he hung up. The voice on the other end had been firm, clinical, yet urgent, carrying the weight of inevitability. There had been miscalculations, structural misalignments in the pension fund, exposure to volatile assets, liabilities unaccounted for decades. In other words, the system they had trusted, relied upon, even built their lives around, was faltering. And they were not alone. Margaret watched him from the kitchen doorway, her eyes wary but steady. She didn't need to ask. They both understood that a quiet catastrophe was unfolding, invisible to most, relentless, and devastating. The room seemed smaller, heavier, the light of the single desk lamp casting long shadows across the ledgers that had once symbolized security. Tommy's letters came more frequently now, each one carrying a sense of urgency born from Chicago's financial chaos. The 1990s had begun with optimism, technology rising, markets expanding, globalization accelerating, but for families like the Harrisons, those advances were double-edged. High returns masked systemic instability, while assumptions baked into long-term plans failed to account for unforeseen complexity. Tommy wrote of hedge funds, derivative risks, and the potential for rapid market swings. The language was technical, precise, and frightening in its implications. Decades of planning could be undone by a single misaligned variable. William and Margaret began to reassess everything. Savings accounts, pension projections, healthcare costs, college funds for grandchildren, each line item was now a potential risk. They consulted new financial advisors, analysts who spoke of market correlations, inflation trends, and demographic pressures. The more they learned, the more they realized how much had been assumed, how little truly guaranteed. Their family's security, built painstakingly over decades, rested precariously atop shifting economic sands. In 1992, a mild recession hit, subtle compared to the crashes of previous decades, yet enough to shake confidence. Factories in Ohio closed or downsized, unemployment crept upward, and local businesses faltered. William's factory held on, but production slowed. He took on extra shifts, his hands calloused, mind tense. Margaret supplemented income with tutoring, coaching children in reading and math, bringing home small but steady earnings. Every action was a response to external pressure, every decision a shield against forces beyond their control. Tommy's warnings grew sharper. He called one evening from Chicago, voice tight. "Dad, Mom, the models are showing something you need to see. Your fund is exposed to equities that are over-leveraged. The projections from 1985? They're obsolete. You're at risk of running out decades sooner than anyone planned." The words landed like stones, heavy, undeniable. The Harrisons convened around the kitchen table, ledgers spread out, calculators in hand. Margaret traced lines with a pencil, recalculating growth, subtracting liabilities, considering every possible adjustment. William listened, internalizing every number, every warning, every potential failure. It was a new kind of battle, less physical than the ones they had faced in youth, but equally demanding, requiring constant vigilance, calculation, and adaptation. Meanwhile, society at large was undergoing dramatic shifts. The rise of technology, the internet, and globalized trade had created wealth for some but introduced volatility for many. Retirement planning, once grounded in predictable pensions and moderate inflation, now required navigation of markets driven by algorithms, speculation, and unpredictable geopolitical events. For the Harrisons, these trends were no longer abstract, they were immediate, visible, and threatening. By 1995, the family faced another reality: their children's futures were entwined with their own. Tommy's son, Ethan, was beginning school, and conversations around college funds and long-term planning became urgent. Could they ensure the next generation's security when their own foundation showed cracks? Margaret's meticulous tracking and William's long experience could mitigate some risk, but the broader economic forces were relentless. Decisions once thought minor, how to invest, whether to downsize, what expenses to prioritize, now carried amplified consequences. It was during this time that William began noticing subtle discrepancies in statements, small enough to escape casual attention but significant when traced across decades. Funds allocated to safe investments were underperforming relative to inflation. Healthcare assumptions underestimated rising costs. Social Security, while stable, was insufficient to cover the gap. Each discovery felt like a domino, threatening to tip the entire carefully constructed structure. The Harrisons were forced into choices no family likes to make: delaying home repairs, scaling back retirement contributions, withdrawing modest amounts from investments earlier than planned. Every sacrifice was a visible reminder that the life they had worked to secure was no longer guaranteed. William found himself awake at night, the glow of the desk lamp illuminating decades of ledgers, thinking of the unseen forces, market behaviors, policy shifts, interest rate fluctuations, that could undo everything. Then came 1997, a year that would mark a new chapter of tension. The Asian financial crisis sent ripples through global markets, causing temporary dips in stocks and volatility that affected portfolios worldwide. Though their pension fund was primarily domestic, interconnectedness meant exposure to risk they could not fully anticipate. News reports detailed sudden losses in foreign investments, bankruptcies of once stable companies, and currency fluctuations that moved markets unpredictably. For the Harrisons, the abstract global economy had become personal, tangible, immediate. Margaret, ever precise, began cataloging every ripple effect. She mapped correlations between interest rates, inflation, and fund performance. William studied market reports, sometimes until the early hours, trying to understand forces that seemed to defy logic. Together, they built models, scenarios, contingency plans. Yet each solution seemed temporary, fragile, a patch against an unseen storm. Tommy visited in the summer of 1998, bringing charts, spreadsheets, and urgent advice. "Dad, Mom, this is worse than you think. The fund assumes market growth that may never materialize. Adjusting for real-world volatility, you could face a serious shortfall within the next decade." The words were precise, unemotional, yet carried the weight of dread. They were experts in their own way, trained to predict, model, and mitigate, yet even they acknowledged the uncertainty. Late that evening, the family sat around the living room, a quiet tension filling the space. The walls, lined with decades of photographs, books, and memorabilia, seemed to lean inward. William reflected on the path they had taken, decades of careful saving, meticulous planning, discipline, and patience. And now, all of it was under threat, not by negligence or error, but by forces larger, subtler, and more relentless than any one family could control. Margaret, sensing his despair, placed a hand on his shoulder. "We've faced challenges before, William. We'll face this too. We have each other, and we have a plan." But even as she spoke, the truth was undeniable. The plan could slow the collapse, perhaps even mitigate the worst, but it could not guarantee certainty. The foundation they had built, solid as it had seemed, was being tested by forces decades in the making. And then, just as hope began to resurface, a call came from the pension fund administrator. The voice was calm, professional, but the message was unmistakable. A reevaluation of assets had revealed additional exposure in high-risk investments. Funds assumed secure had been tied to volatile equities, projected returns were overly optimistic. The administrator's final words hung in the room like a weight. "Mr. Harrison, the numbers indicate your fund could run dry years earlier than even our previous projections suggested. Immediate action is required." William froze, heart pounding. The ledgers, charts, and notes that had once represented control now symbolized fragility, the precarious balance between planning and reality. Outside, the wind rattled the windows, leaves tumbling across the yard like reminders of impermanence. Margaret grasped his hand, her grip steady but firm. "We'll adapt," she whispered. William nodded, though doubt gnawed at him. How much could they control? How many sacrifices would it take to survive forces beyond their comprehension? And even if they acted now, could they truly safeguard decades of effort, the stability of their lives, and the future of the next generation? The night stretched long and heavy. William sat alone later, ledgers sprawled before him, notes scattered, numbers swimming under the lamplight. He realized with chilling clarity that the battles of the past, the wars, the recessions, the market crashes, had been preparations, precursors to a challenge more insidious, less visible, yet potentially more destructive: the slow, relentless erosion of retirement security. And then, a sudden knock at the door shattered the tense quiet. A neighbor, unfamiliar yet insistent, stood outside, a document in hand, eyes wide. "Mr. Harrison. I think you need to see this," the neighbor said. The paper trembled in his fingers, evidence of something unexpected, something that could not be ignored. The camera pans to William, hand frozen on the door handle, the neighbor holding the mysterious document. Outside, the autumn wind whips through Maplewood Avenue, scattering leaves and shadows across the driveway. Whatever lay within that paper, whatever revelation it carried, would threaten to unravel not just decades of planning, but the very security of the Harrison family's future. William's hand hovered over the door handle, his knuckles pale against the brass. The neighbor's eyes, wide and unblinking, held a quiet urgency. Margaret emerged from the kitchen, sensing the weight of the moment before it was spoken. The paper trembled slightly in the man's fingers as he extended it toward William. Found this in the local financial office, he said, voice low. Thought you should see it immediately. William took it, unfolding the sheet carefully. Numbers, projections, and notes sprawled across the page, indicating an alarming trend, a hidden exposure within the pension fund. What had once seemed a minor risk now appeared systemic, an intricate web of over-leveraged investments, underfunded accounts, and poorly anticipated liabilities. The calculations were precise, the implications devastating. Margaret leaned close, reading over his shoulder. "It's worse than we thought," she murmured, the tremor in her voice betraying the calm she tried to maintain. "This isn't just a miscalculation. It's structural." The late 1990s in America were a period of rapid transformation. Technology was exploding, globalization was accelerating, and financial markets were interlinked in ways previously unimaginable. Traditional retirement plans, based on predictable wages and moderate inflation, struggled to adjust to a world of algorithmic trading, volatile equities, and policy shifts. For families like the Harrisons, these macroeconomic forces were no longer distant abstractions, they were immediate threats. The Harrisons spent hours analyzing the document. Every line item suggested that previous efforts, years of careful saving, meticulous budgeting, and cautious investing, were insufficient to guarantee stability. Even conservative assets, once deemed safe, had been indirectly affected by global trends. Margaret traced her finger along columns of data, calculating revised projections, while William made notes, documenting potential contingencies. Tommy's calls from Chicago intensified during this period. His career had placed him in the heart of financial hubs, observing firsthand the delicate balance between risk and reward. He explained complex derivatives, currency exposures, and asset-backed securities, making his parents realize that decades of personal planning were now at the mercy of forces they could barely influence. By 1999, the dot-com bubble was beginning to swell. Stock valuations soared, seemingly untethered from traditional metrics of stability. Families like the Harrisons watched with cautious optimism, aware that high returns often carried hidden vulnerabilities. William and Margaret reviewed each of their accounts with renewed scrutiny, trying to understand which investments were truly secure, and which could vanish in the event of a sudden downturn. Amidst these financial pressures, personal challenges emerged. Margaret faced early signs of health issues, subtle yet persistent. Routine checkups revealed conditions that, while manageable, promised escalating costs over the coming decades. Each doctor's bill, each procedure, was now a tangible reminder of the fragility of security, and how unanticipated expenses could erode even the most carefully constructed plans. Tommy, concerned for both his parents and his own future, suggested diversifying beyond traditional vehicles. Real estate, safer bonds, and liquid assets became central to their revised strategy. Yet even these options carried uncertainty. Real estate markets could shift unexpectedly, interest rates could fluctuate, and long-term returns were never guaranteed. The couple learned that adaptation was not optional, it was survival. The Harrison household transformed into a hub of constant calculation. Ledgers, spreadsheets, and charts cluttered every surface. William reviewed investment statements nightly, Margaret monitored every expense, and together they simulated countless scenarios: mild recessions, high inflation, early retirement, prolonged healthcare needs. Each simulation revealed the same uncomfortable truth: certainty was impossible, security temporary, and the margin for error vanishingly small. One evening in early 2000, a meeting with a financial advisor brought new revelations. The advisor, a veteran of multiple market cycles, explained that the exposure in their pension fund was linked to systemic mispricing in certain asset classes, a chain reaction initiated years earlier, now reaching full visibility. The fund's assumptions were based on historical averages, he said. But averages don't predict extremes. You're looking at a worst-case scenario that's now probable. The word settled over William like a leaden cloud. Decades of planning, decades of sacrifices, now threatened not by negligence, but by forces that had grown quietly, invisibly, for years. The Harrisons realized that personal diligence, while essential, was insufficient in a world where external factors could override even the best-laid strategies. At home, discussions became tense but necessary. The couple debated liquidating certain assets, restructuring investments, and adjusting lifestyle expectations. Margaret's meticulous notes provided clarity, yet clarity brought no comfort, only understanding of the scale of the challenge. The family's future, once a slowly unfolding promise, now required deliberate, continuous intervention. By mid-2000, subtle signs of strain appeared in the local economy. Small businesses struggled, layoffs in industrial sectors became more frequent, and the cost of living steadily increased. The Harrisons, while proactive, could not shield themselves entirely. The cumulative impact of decades of slow erosion, healthcare, inflation, pension miscalculations, manifested as stress, fatigue, and the realization that their fight for stability was ongoing, relentless, and personal. In September, an unexpected letter arrived from the pension fund administrator, warning of further adjustments due to underperforming allocations in international equities. The timing was ominous, markets were volatile, and predictions suggested prolonged uncertainty. William's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the envelope. Margaret watched silently, a mixture of calm and concern in her eyes. The numbers confirmed what they feared, what they had always suspected. The Harrisons' retirement fund, once considered reliable, was now exposed to risk far greater than initially understood. Tommy flew back to Ohio for a family meeting. He arrived late one night, carrying documents, charts, and projections. The three of them sat in the dimly lit living room, reviewing the implications. "Dad, Mom, it's worse than we thought. Even conservative estimates suggest you could face significant shortfalls within the next decade," Tommy said quietly, voice measured but urgent. "The good news is, you still have options, but only if we act now." The discussion lasted hours. Strategies were proposed, debated, and revised. Liquidation of certain assets, diversification of remaining funds, and careful budgeting were agreed upon. Every decision required weighing risk against necessity, balancing immediate sacrifices against long-term security. Each step reminded the Harrisons that the decades of careful preparation had always existed within a system more fragile than they realized. Just as the meeting concluded, a sudden notification appeared on Tommy's laptop, a news alert regarding a failing financial institution with exposure to funds similar to their pension. Panic surged briefly in the room. The Harrisons understood that systemic risk was no longer theoretical. The very fabric of the financial network they relied upon was beginning to show cracks, cracks that could widen unexpectedly, potentially erasing decades of effort. Margaret stood by the window, staring at the quiet suburban street outside. Leaves rustled in the evening wind, the shadows long and restless. "William, we've done everything we can, but it's still not enough," she said softly. Her voice carried both resignation and determination. William nodded, aware that their vigilance had delayed disaster, mitigated losses, and preserved dignity, but that the storm they faced was far from over. They were participants in forces far larger than their household, forces shaped by markets, policies, and global events beyond their control. And then, as the family sat in tense silence, the phone rang. The caller ID showed the local financial regulator's office. A calm but unmistakably urgent voice came through. "Mr. Harrison, we're calling regarding recent findings in several pension funds. There's new information that could affect your family directly. We need you to come in immediately." William set down the phone slowly, looking at Margaret and Tommy. The ledger on the coffee table, filled with years of careful calculations, now seemed simultaneously comforting and futile. The external forces, invisible yet inexorable, had advanced another step. The next move would not be simple, and the consequences could redefine the life they had built. The camera lingers on William's face, shadowed by the lamp's glow, the phone still in his hand. Outside, the wind sweeps across Maplewood Avenue, scattering leaves like fragments of decades-long security. The regulator's call is more than a routine update, it is a summons into a deeper storm, one that could unravel everything the Harrisons have fought to preserve. William gripped the receiver as the voice on the other end detailed a situation that seemed both bureaucratic and terrifying. "Mr. Harrison," the regulator said, calm yet insistent, "several pension funds have been identified with underreported liabilities. Your fund is among them. Immediate review and action are required. Delays could result in irreversible consequences." The word struck like a hammer. Margaret stood behind him, hand resting lightly on his shoulder, offering silent support. She understood, as he did, that decades of careful planning, careful savings, and disciplined living were now entangled with forces beyond their control. The quiet security they had taken for granted was slipping, and there was no easy way to reclaim it. The call ended, leaving a silence that pressed against the walls of the Harrison home. Outside, late 2000s wind rattled the trees, carrying the distant hum of a world moving on, unaware of the storm inside this small Ohio household. William sat for a moment, staring at the desk piled with ledgers, charts, and letters, trying to absorb the weight of new reality. The early 2000s were a period of optimism for some, but volatility for many. The dot-com bubble had created wealth for a few, but for conservative investors, it posed hidden threats, misallocated funds, overinflated equities, and systemic fragility that traditional financial models did not anticipate. The Harrisons, who had relied on measured growth, suddenly found themselves participants in a system more unpredictable than ever. Margaret suggested they review every aspect of their finances immediately. Together with Tommy, who had flown in from Chicago again, they set up the dining room as a temporary command center. Laptops hummed, calculators clicked, and pens scratched across paper as the family recalculated every projection. They mapped scenarios, mild recessions, severe market corrections, early medical expenses. Every simulation suggested uncertainty, some small margin for maneuver, but no guarantees. Tommy's expertise had grown during his years on Wall Street. He explained derivatives, foreign investments, and the cascading impact of market instability. "Dad, Mom," he said, voice steady but urgent, "the fund's exposure to international equities and high-risk bonds means we could see significant depletion within 10 years, possibly sooner if a market shock occurs. We need contingency plans now." The Harrisons spent hours revising strategies. They considered liquidating certain assets, reallocating funds to more conservative investments, and even delaying parts of their retirement. Every choice was weighed carefully, balancing immediate sacrifice against long-term security. Margaret's meticulous notes ensured that nothing was overlooked, William's experience provided perspective. Yet each decision highlighted the fragility of the life they had built. In parallel, subtle pressures emerged in daily life. Margaret's health, though stable, required more frequent monitoring. William worked longer hours, adding strain to a body no longer as resilient as in youth. The couple faced a paradox: their efforts to protect security demanded resources, time, energy, emotional resilience, that themselves had limits. The external forces, market fluctuations, regulatory changes, inflation, continued to press relentlessly, indifferent to personal effort. By mid-2001, new challenges arrived with startling speed. Global events, the 9/11 attacks, sudden shifts in markets, geopolitical uncertainty, exacerbated vulnerabilities. Retirement plans, even carefully structured ones, were suddenly exposed to risks that had seemed distant. For the Harrisons, these events underscored a harsh truth: stability was never absolute, and external crises could amplify hidden weaknesses, threatening security decades in the making. One evening, William and Margaret received a notice of pending adjustments to their fund. The language was formal, clinical, yet the meaning was unmistakable. Projected returns would be lower, liquidity constrained, and future benefits uncertain. For the first time, the couple confronted a reality they had long avoided: their carefully built plan might not fully sustain them through retirement. Tommy analyzed the figures with meticulous care. "We can survive this," he said, "but it will require lifestyle changes, disciplined withdrawals, and constant monitoring. Any misstep could accelerate depletion. It's no longer enough to trust assumptions, we must actively manage risk every day." The family implemented changes immediately. Subscriptions were cancelled, discretionary spending curtailed, and planned vacations postponed indefinitely. William began working part-time consulting jobs in addition to his factory shifts. Margaret increased tutoring hours, accepting clients in the evenings. Every adjustment was a tactical response, designed to protect the life they had built, yet the constant pressure created a tension that weighed on their family. By 2003, the landscape had shifted further. The economy was recovering from early 2000s recessions, yet volatility remained high. Healthcare costs continued to rise faster than inflation. Social Security adjustments were modest, unable to offset the erosion of purchasing power. The Harrisons had stabilized, but their foundation remained vulnerable. Then came another shock, a notice from the pension fund administrators indicating a misallocation of investments in high-risk assets. The administrators admitted oversight. Decades-old assumptions had underestimated exposure to volatile international markets. The revised projections painted a stark picture: without significant intervention, the Harrisons could face a critical shortfall within 5 to 7 years. William, staring at the pages, felt a familiar weight, the same that had accompanied him through previous crises. He realized that no amount of discipline, foresight, or effort could entirely mitigate structural vulnerabilities. The family's security, long taken for granted, rested atop a network of assumptions and interdependencies, now fully exposed. Margaret's calm efficiency became their anchor. She organized every document, cross-referenced decades of transactions, and created models to simulate future contingencies. Tommy assisted, providing insights from contemporary financial practices, but even he acknowledged the limits of control. The Harrisons were no longer merely managing personal finances, they were navigating a complex system whose stability they could influence only partially. By late 2004, the family faced an impossible decision: how much to sacrifice now to preserve some semblance of security in the future. Every choice, selling property, delaying retirement, reallocating investments, carried immediate discomfort and long-term implications. The Harrisons understood that survival depended on adaptation, not certainty. Then, one morning, an unexpected visitor arrived. A representative from a national financial oversight committee, unfamiliar and authoritative, requested an urgent meeting. The visitor brought documents highlighting potential regulatory interventions, new rules for fund management, and additional exposures that could impact their portfolio. William read the documents with growing dread. The complexity was staggering. Regulatory changes, market volatility, and hidden structural risks converged into a force the Harrisons could not fully anticipate or control. They realized that their battle for security had evolved into a confrontation with an unpredictable system, one in which careful planning could only mitigate, not eliminate, risk. The family gathered in the living room that evening. Laptops hummed, papers rustled, pens scratched margins. Every new piece of information demanded attention. Margaret and William shared a glance, acknowledging the gravity of the moment. Tommy's voice broke the silence. "Dad, Mom, this isn't just about projections anymore. This is about survival. Every decision from here on will affect not just you, but Ethan, and possibly the next generation." The weight of responsibility pressed down. Every calculation, every plan, every adjustment now carried immediate consequences. The Harrisons had lived decades trusting in the stability of systems, employment, pensions, social security, but those systems, they realized, were neither infallible nor static. And then, just as they began to plan their next steps, the phone rang again. William answered, wary. The voice on the line was unfamiliar, crisp, and urgent. Mr. Harrison. I'm calling on behalf of an independent oversight group. We've uncovered irregularities in several pension funds, including yours. This requires immediate attention. What you do next will determine whether your retirement remains viable or collapses completely. William froze, phone in hand, feeling the gravity of decades compressed into a single moment. Outside, the wind swept across Maplewood Avenue, rattling leaves against windows and shaking the quiet suburban street. The storm they had long feared was no longer theoretical. It had arrived, tangible and unstoppable, and the Harrisons were at its center. The camera lingers on William's face, the phone pressed to his ear, Margaret gripping his shoulder, Tommy beside him. Papers, ledgers, and charts scatter across the living room table, symbols of decades of preparation now threatened by forces far beyond their control. The voice on the other end of the line speaks of urgent revelations, irregularities, and imminent danger. What will they discover next, and how will the family survive the unraveling of the security they had spent a lifetime building? William held the receiver, feeling the weight of the unseen storm pressing on his chest. The voice on the line was calm, professional, but carried an unspoken urgency. Irregularities had been found in their pension fund, mismanaged allocations, underreported liabilities, and exposure to volatile international markets. The decades of careful saving, meticulous record-keeping, and disciplined living now faced forces beyond their control. Margaret stood beside him, hand resting lightly on his shoulder. She had witnessed every challenge William had faced, every crisis, yet this one felt different. It was no longer a question of personal diligence or careful planning, it was systemic. The very structures that had promised stability were faltering. The early 2000s were a turbulent time for retirement security in America. The dot-com bubble had left many portfolios inflated with risky equities. Interest rates fluctuated, inflation crept upward, and globalization introduced new vulnerabilities. For families like the Harrisons, the very instruments designed to ensure financial security, pension funds, social security, and long-term investments, were no longer guarantees but variables in a complex, unpredictable system. Tommy arrived that evening, carrying a laptop, a stack of documents, and a grim sense of urgency. He had seen the volatility firsthand on Wall Street, watched companies rise and fall in hours, and understood the cascading effect of market shocks. He laid out charts, projections, and simulations for his parents. "Dad, Mom, these irregularities aren't minor. They could accelerate the depletion of your retirement fund by a decade, maybe more. We need immediate strategies, or we could face catastrophic shortfalls." Margaret and William sat, absorbing the magnitude of the situation. Every calculation they had made over decades now required revision. The assumptions underlying their plans, the stability of pensions, the reliability of investments, the predictability of expenses, had been destabilized. The family's security, carefully built over years, had become precarious. They spent the following days immersed in financial analysis. Every ledger, statement, and projection was scrutinized. Margaret recalculated healthcare expenses, factoring in rising costs. William reassessed the pension projections, adjusting for volatility and the newly discovered fund irregularities. Tommy modeled multiple scenarios, simulating worst-case market conditions. Each exercise revealed a consistent pattern. Without immediate, decisive action, the Harrisons risked losing decades of accumulated security. By 2005, subtle pressures began to manifest in their daily lives. William took on additional consulting work, stretching himself physically and mentally. Margaret extended tutoring hours, balancing income generation with care for the household. Discretionary spending was curtailed, vacations cancelled, and long-term plans postponed. Each adjustment was a defensive measure against an unseen, encroaching threat. Global financial markets, meanwhile, remained volatile. The early 2000s recession had left lingering uncertainty, and geopolitical events, the Iraq War, energy crises, and fluctuating interest rates, amplified systemic risk. Even well-diversified portfolios could not escape exposure. The Harrisons' careful management had slowed potential losses, but systemic forces continued to erode their security. In the midst of these challenges, personal stakes grew. Margaret's health required more frequent attention, and medical costs increased steadily. The couple faced a paradox: efforts to maintain financial security demanded energy, time, and emotional resilience, all of which were finite resources. The stress of managing risk became a constant companion, an invisible weight pressing on their lives. Then, in mid-2006, a new development arrived. A government auditor requested an urgent meeting, citing the pension fund's irregularities and potential regulatory intervention. William and Margaret, already strained, now faced the possibility that their carefully constructed plans could be legally disrupted or restructured in ways they could not control. The notion that their future could be reshaped by external mandates added a layer of anxiety beyond financial calculations. Tommy reviewed the documents from the auditor. "Dad, Mom, it's worse than we imagined. Regulatory action could freeze funds temporarily, adjust benefits, or impose new constraints. Any delay in response could magnify losses significantly. We need a coordinated approach, and it needs to happen now." The family convened that evening, surrounded by ledgers, laptops, and notes. They mapped out immediate actions, contacting legal advisors, restructuring investments where possible, creating liquid reserves, and prioritizing essential expenses. Each decision was deliberate, tactical, and designed to mitigate the impact of forces beyond their control. Despite their efforts, uncertainty remained. The irregularities in the pension fund were symptomatic of larger systemic issues: underfunding, reliance on volatile assets, and insufficient regulatory oversight. The Harrisons realized that their struggle was not unique but representative of a broader societal challenge. Millions of Americans depended on systems that were increasingly exposed to complex, interrelated risks. By late 2007, the family's vigilance was tested again. The early signs of the financial crisis began to appear: mortgage defaults, market instability, and the collapse of key financial institutions. Though their pension fund was not directly tied to subprime mortgages, the interconnectedness of global finance meant exposure was unavoidable. Every market fluctuation, every policy announcement, every economic shock threatened to accelerate the erosion of their security. William and Margaret adapted. They reallocated assets to safer investments, maintained stricter control over household spending, and continued working longer hours. Tommy monitored market trends, adjusting projections daily. Each day was a negotiation with uncertainty, a balancing act to preserve the future they had envisioned decades earlier. Yet even as they acted decisively, the psychological toll was undeniable. The constant stress, vigilance, and fear of unforeseen developments became a daily reality. Nights were restless, mornings filled with calculation, afternoons devoted to mitigation. The family understood intellectually that survival required discipline and adaptation, yet emotionally, the weight of decades of planning at risk was suffocating. In early 2008, the global financial crisis erupted. Major institutions collapsed, markets plunged, and the ripple effects were immediate. The Harrisons' pension fund, despite careful adjustments, suffered losses. The shortfall they had feared for decades now accelerated with alarming speed. Years of disciplined saving, careful investment, and meticulous planning were suddenly threatened on a scale they had never imagined. Tommy, monitoring the unfolding crisis from Chicago, called urgently. "Dad, Mom, the fund's exposure is worse than projections. We need to consider immediate liquidation of certain assets, restructuring, and possibly drawing on savings earlier than planned. Every day we wait increases risk." The family acted swiftly. Assets were reallocated, some sold to preserve liquidity, and spending was reduced further. But the speed and magnitude of the financial collapse made it clear, systemic forces could outpace even the most rigorous personal management. And then, in the midst of these actions, a new letter arrived. This one from the pension fund administrators, formal and precise. An internal review had identified additional misallocated investments, further reducing projected returns. The document was stark, its implications immediate. The family's careful mitigation could slow losses, but not prevent them entirely. William held the letter in silence, the weight of decades of preparation pressing down. Margaret, standing beside him, placed a hand on his arm. Tommy, reviewing spreadsheets on a laptop, glanced up with a grim expression. The room was filled with papers, numbers, and the quiet hum of machines, but the reality was clear: the system they had relied upon for decades was failing, and their future, once secure, now hung in delicate balance. The camera panned slowly across the dining room, ledgers, and charts scattered like a battlefield. Outside, the wind sweeps through Maplewood Avenue, rattling leaves and whispering uncertainty. The phone rings once more, an unknown number flashing on the screen. William hesitates, knowing the next call could bring clarity, confirmation, or a revelation that accelerates the unraveling. The fate of decades of planning rests in a single moment. What will the voice on the other end reveal? William's hand hovered over the phone, uncertainty gripping him. The unknown number flashed insistently, a reminder that each call, each message, could carry consequences far beyond their control. Margaret stood silently beside him, sensing the weight of decades collapsing into a single moment. Tommy watched from the dining table, spreadsheets open, models updated, scenarios plotted, but even he could not remove the emotional gravity that had settled over the household. Finally, William answered. The voice on the line was unfamiliar but calm, precise. "Mr. Harrison, I am calling from the Financial Oversight Committee regarding your pension fund. Recent reviews indicate additional misallocated assets, exposure to high-risk securities, and potential regulatory interventions. Immediate action is required to prevent accelerated depletion of your retirement funds. We are scheduling a meeting to discuss options and requirements." The words landed like stones. Margaret's hand tightened around William's arm. They had anticipated challenges, calculated risks, and adapted strategies for decades, but this was unprecedented. The meticulous planning, the sacrifices, the constant vigilance, all were now confronted by systemic forces they could not fully influence. The early months of 2008 were chaotic. Globally, markets were unraveling. Lehman Brothers teetered on collapse, housing markets plummeted, and financial institutions exposed to subprime mortgages faced insolvency. Though the Harrisons' pension fund was not directly invested in subprime instruments, the interconnectedness of global finance meant that ripple effects were unavoidable. Losses in equities, reduced liquidity, and volatility amplified vulnerabilities they had long monitored. In the Harrison household, the atmosphere shifted. William took on consulting projects far beyond his usual work, extending hours into the night. Margaret increased tutoring sessions, balancing income generation with household management. The couple had always been disciplined, resilient, but the relentless pressure, both financial and emotional, introduced fatigue they could not ignore. Tommy became the de facto strategist. He updated spreadsheets constantly, simulating multiple outcomes: mild market corrections, severe downturns, liquidity crises. Each scenario highlighted the delicate balance they maintained. A single misstep could accelerate the depletion of retirement savings by years. The family's security, built over decades, now depended on continuous intervention, vigilance, and sometimes, sheer luck. The financial crisis affected not only their accounts but their perception of stability. Social security adjustments were modest, healthcare costs continued to rise, and even safe investments were not immune to market shocks. The system they had trusted, a combination of government programs, private pensions, and long-term investments, was no longer a guarantee. Every decision carried amplified consequences, and the margin for error had narrowed drastically. By mid-2008, the Harrisons faced a stark reality: immediate action was essential. Assets were liquidated selectively, reallocations made to reduce exposure, and household expenditures cut to the bone. Even with these measures, projections suggested that their retirement funds could fall short within the next 5 years. The erosion of decades of careful planning was accelerating, and the family's lifelong strategy had transformed into a daily battle against uncertainty. Margaret's health became another dimension of concern. Routine checkups revealed manageable conditions, yet the projected medical costs loomed large in their recalculated budget. Each appointment, procedure, and medication added layers of urgency. The couple understood that financial survival was intertwined with physical well-being. Every dollar saved or spent could influence not only security but quality of life. Tommy visited regularly, each visit filled with strategy sessions. "Dad, Mom, the exposure isn't minor. We need to consider broader measures, including temporary downsizing, early withdrawals, and contingency plans for worst-case scenarios," he advised. The discussion was tense but necessary. The family had learned that adaptation was the only path forward, yet every adjustment carried personal and emotional cost. Amid these financial and personal pressures, external forces continued to shift unpredictably. Global markets were volatile, energy prices fluctuated, and policy responses were uneven. The Harrisons realized that their struggle was not isolated. It was a microcosm of systemic instability affecting millions of Americans. Families across the nation faced similar challenges, often without awareness or preparation. In September 2008, the collapse of Lehman Brothers sent shockwaves through markets worldwide. Panic gripped investors, liquidity evaporated, and the interconnected financial system trembled. The Harrisons' portfolio, though cautiously managed, experienced significant declines. Years of savings, careful investments, and disciplined contributions were suddenly threatened by forces that could not be mitigated entirely. The family convened in the living room, surrounded by ledgers, laptops, and charts. Each document represented decades of planning, effort, and sacrifice. Yet the numbers, once reassuring, now reflected uncertainty, risk, and potential loss. Margaret's hands trembled slightly as she reviewed medical expense projections. William's gaze lingered on investment statements, and Tommy's voice carried the measured intensity of someone who understood both strategy and human stakes. Late one evening, as the wind rattled the windows and Maplewood Avenue lay quiet beneath a canopy of autumn leaves, another notice arrived. This time from the pension administrators. Exposure to high-risk assets had worsened, regulatory review was imminent, and projected returns were reduced further. The document was clear: without immediate intervention, the Harrison family faced accelerated depletion of retirement funds, with consequences cascading into every aspect of life. William felt a familiar, oppressive weight. The careful planning of decades was confronting the reality of systemic vulnerability. Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip steady but firm, silently communicating resilience amid uncertainty. Tommy, reviewing updated projections on his laptop, finally looked up. "We've mitigated some losses," he said, voice measured, "but the next moves are critical. Any misstep could accelerate depletion beyond our ability to respond." The family's daily routines became an intricate ballet of calculation and adaptation. Household expenditures were minimized, additional income streams explored, and investments monitored continuously. Each day was a negotiation with uncertainty, a balancing act between survival and the preservation of dignity, independence, and quality of life. Then, in October 2008, the phone rang again. The unknown caller ID displayed the Financial Oversight Committee. William answered, tense. The voice on the line carried an urgency that transcended procedure. "Mr. Harrison, we have uncovered further irregularities in your fund. Regulatory measures may be enforced within days. Immediate action is required. What you do now will determine the viability of your retirement." William's hands gripped the phone tightly. Margaret and Tommy leaned in, absorbing the implications. The room, filled with papers and digital screens, seemed to contract under the weight of decades of preparation suddenly threatened by external forces. The calm of past decades, the slow accumulation of security, the predictable rhythm of life, was gone. In its place, uncertainty, volatility, and the relentless pressure of unseen systemic forces dominated every decision. As the call ended, the family sat in silence. Each member understood the stakes. Their actions in the coming hours and days would influence the trajectory of decades-long planning, the security of their retirement, and the well-being of future generations. Outside, the wind swept through the neighborhood, scattering leaves across the quiet street, a subtle echo of the chaos unfolding in markets, policies, and life itself. The camera lingers on William's face, tense, hand trembling slightly over the receiver. Margaret's eyes are steady but haunted. Tommy's laptop glows with projections of risk. Outside, the wind carries leaves across Maplewood Avenue like fragments of decades of security. The Oversight Committee's warning is more than procedural. It is a signal that the forces threatening the Harrisons' life are immediate, systemic, and unforgiving. The next move could define the difference between survival and collapse. The morning sun filtered weakly through the living room blinds, casting long, restless shadows over the ledgers and charts scattered across the Harrisons' dining table. William sat hunched, reviewing projections that seemed to shift daily. Every line of numbers, every column of potential outcomes, carried weight he had never felt in decades of careful planning. The pension fund's exposure to high-risk assets, coupled with accelerating market volatility, had created a situation where even small errors could have catastrophic consequences. Margaret brewed coffee, moving quietly around the room, her presence a tether to normalcy amid chaos. She knew that today, like many days before, would require meticulous attention, rapid decision-making, and the endurance of unrelenting pressure. Her own health, already a concern, added urgency to the family's actions. Each decision carried dual stakes: financial stability and the preservation of their physical and emotional well-being. Tommy's laptop glowed with projections, simulations, and scenario analyses. He had grown into his role as strategist and advisor for the family, translating complex market movements and regulatory changes into actionable steps. "Dad, Mom," he said, voice measured but tense, "the fund's current trajectory shows depletion could occur 5 to 7 years sooner than anticipated. Even with adjustments, exposure remains. We need to take immediate action to mitigate further risk." The family's plan, once methodical and long-term, had shifted into a continuous crisis response. Every decision, asset reallocation, expense reduction, or investment adjustment, was reactive, executed under the pressure of real-time uncertainty. The slow rhythm of decades-long planning had given way to an urgent, relentless cadence: observe, assess, act, repeat. By late 2008, the global financial crisis was in full swing. Major institutions collapsed, credit froze, and markets fluctuated violently. Though the Harrisons' investments were not directly tied to subprime mortgages, the systemic exposure was unavoidable. Even conservative allocations suffered losses. The family realized with mounting apprehension that decades of disciplined saving could not fully insulate them from forces far beyond their control. In the midst of this uncertainty, regulatory oversight intensified. A notice arrived from the Financial Oversight Committee, summoning William and Margaret for an urgent review of the fund. The letter outlined potential interventions, freezes on certain accounts, mandatory adjustments to asset allocations, and reporting requirements that could constrain their flexibility. The procedural language masked the stakes clearly: inaction or delay could accelerate depletion, imperil retirement security, and introduce legal complications. The Harrisons spent hours preparing for the meeting. Margaret compiled detailed records, cross-referencing decades of contributions, allocations, and withdrawals. William reviewed legal and financial documents, ensuring they could respond to every potential question or directive. Tommy analyzed the potential outcomes of various regulatory actions, simulating the immediate and long-term consequences. The family understood that failure to respond effectively could have irreversible consequences. That evening, William and Margaret attended the oversight meeting. The room was stark, filled with legal and financial personnel whose calm demeanor contrasted sharply with the urgency of the message. Charts and spreadsheets were presented, each highlighting structural weaknesses, exposure to high-risk assets, and discrepancies between projected and actual returns. The regulators emphasized that while adjustments were possible, timing and precision were critical. William explained decades of planning, contributions, and mitigation strategies, emphasizing the family's proactive efforts. Margaret supplemented the narrative with meticulous records and calculations. Tommy addressed complex exposure issues, demonstrating an understanding of market behavior and potential interventions. The presentation, though thorough, could not erase the reality of systemic vulnerability. Forces outside the family's control dominated the outcome. Returning home, the family absorbed the gravity of the meeting. Adjustments mandated by the Oversight Committee would introduce new challenges: restricted liquidity, recalibrated projections, and further reductions in discretionary income. The carefully constructed path to security had narrowed, requiring precision, discipline, and continuous vigilance. As the financial crisis deepened, personal stakes became increasingly acute. Margaret's health required more frequent monitoring, and the cost of care was rising. William, balancing work, strategy, and emotional support, felt the strain acutely. The family's emotional resilience was tested alongside financial prudence, each challenge compounding the other. By early 2009, the markets showed signs of slow recovery, but volatility persisted. The Harrisons' proactive adjustments, liquidating vulnerable assets, reallocating funds, and minimizing expenditures, had slowed potential losses, but systemic risk remained. Every fluctuation in the global economy resonated in their household. Interest rate changes, unemployment trends, and policy interventions all carried immediate consequences. Tommy emphasized the importance of forward planning despite uncertainty. We need to continue simulating scenarios, managing expenses tightly, and preserving liquidity. The window for error is extremely narrow. Any misstep could accelerate depletion beyond our capacity to respond. His words underscored the precariousness of their situation. Stability was no longer a given, and survival required continuous, informed action. In parallel, societal shifts highlighted broader structural vulnerabilities. Millions of Americans faced similar exposure, relying on systems designed decades earlier, ill-equipped to manage the complexity and volatility of modern finance. The Harrisons' struggle, while intensely personal, reflected a national pattern: dependence on pension structures and market assumptions that had become increasingly unreliable. By mid-2009, the family had established a rigorous daily routine. Mornings were dedicated to reviewing news, market movements, and fund performance. Afternoons focused on work, consulting, and tutoring. Evenings were for strategy sessions, adjusting projections, monitoring regulatory developments, and recalculating expenses. The family understood that constant vigilance was essential. Even a single lapse could compromise decades of preparation. Amid this relentless schedule, personal tensions surfaced. William's fatigue deepened, Margaret's patience frayed under pressure, and Tommy bore the weight of both strategy and emotional mediation. The family faced the dual challenge of managing a financial system that had become unpredictable while maintaining cohesion, support, and morale. Each conversation, each decision, carried the weight of potential consequences stretching years into the future. Late one evening, as the autumn wind rattled the windows of their Maplewood Avenue home, another letter arrived from the Oversight Committee. The message, formal and precise, detailed new findings, misallocated funds in previously considered stable accounts, potential legal ramifications, and urgent recommendations for restructuring. The language was procedural, but the implication was unmistakable: inaction or delay could accelerate depletion, compromise retirement security, and introduce legal complexity. William held the letter, feeling decades of preparation teetering on the edge of instability. Margaret stood beside him, hand on his shoulder, silently reinforcing their shared resolve. Tommy, reviewing updated projections, finally spoke. "Dad, Mom, the next steps are critical. We have to act decisively, or years of careful planning could unravel in months." The family absorbed the gravity of the moment. Their options were limited but actionable: immediate restructuring of vulnerable assets, compliance with oversight mandates, and continued monitoring of volatile markets. Each choice carried consequences for lifestyle, long-term security, and emotional well-being. The stakes had never been higher. The camera lingers on William's hand as he sets the letter down, the envelope trembling slightly under the weight of decades of preparation threatened by systemic forces. Outside, the wind sweeps across Maplewood Avenue, scattering leaves and shadows across the quiet street. The phone rings again, its tone cutting sharply through the tense silence. William picks up, knowing that the voice on the other end could signal guidance, revelation, or the next surge in an unstoppable tide. The Harrison family's carefully constructed world is on the brink, and the next moment could redefine everything. The phone's harsh ring cut through the stillness of the Harrison home, dragging William from his thoughts. Each ring carried the same weight he had come to recognize over the past year: a summons from forces beyond his control, a reminder that every plan, every careful calculation, was still subject to systemic uncertainty. "Mr. Harrison," the voice on the line said, calm yet commanding, "this is the Oversight Committee. Following our previous communications, additional irregularities have been confirmed. Immediate adjustments are required to prevent accelerated depletion of your pension fund. We will provide guidance, but the responsibility to act decisively rests with you." The gravity of the words pressed down. Margaret's hand found his, a grounding presence in the midst of upheaval. Tommy, seated at the dining table, absorbed the update with quiet intensity. Each member of the family understood: the financial storm they had long anticipated was no longer a hypothetical, it was here, tangible, and unrelenting. By 2010, the aftershocks of the global financial crisis had reshaped American retirement security. Pension funds, long regarded as stable instruments, revealed structural weaknesses: underfunded accounts, overexposure to volatile assets, and reliance on outdated projections. Families across the nation, once confident in long-term stability, now faced accelerated depletion and uncertainty. For the Harrisons, the risk was personal, immediate, and systemic. The family convened in the living room, the space transformed into a command center. Laptops glowed with projections, ledgers were spread across every surface, and legal documents were meticulously organized. William reviewed potential asset reallocations, Margaret recalculated medical and living expenses, and Tommy simulated multiple scenarios, each revealing the fragile balance they maintained. "Even with all adjustments," Tommy said, voice steady but tense, "the depletion timeline has shortened. Any misstep, any unexpected expense, could accelerate the loss of retirement security by years. We're managing the best we can, but the environment is unforgiving." The early 2010s were marked by slow recovery but persistent volatility. Stock markets oscillated, interest rates remained low but unpredictable, and inflationary pressures began to rise. Even conservative investments, once considered safe, were subject to external forces. The Harrisons recognized that their strategy had to evolve from preservation to active management. Every day required monitoring, adjustment, and foresight. Meanwhile, personal stakes intensified. Margaret's health required increasing attention, and medical costs grew steadily. William continued consulting, balancing work with relentless oversight of the household finances. The constant stress, compounded by years of vigilance, began to manifest in fatigue, tension, and moments of doubt. The family understood that survival depended not only on financial acumen but emotional resilience. By mid-2011, the Oversight Committee scheduled an in-person review of the Harrisons' fund. The meeting was formal, precise, and unyielding. Regulators outlined remaining exposures, potential legal implications, and immediate corrective measures. Compliance was mandatory. Delay or miscalculation could trigger interventions, asset freezes, or further reductions in projected benefits. William and Margaret presented meticulous records, demonstrating proactive adjustments, liquidity management, and adherence to recommendations. Tommy elaborated on the simulations, highlighting potential outcomes of various market scenarios. Despite their thoroughness, the regulators emphasized systemic vulnerability. The Harrisons' fate remained tied to forces beyond individual control. Returning home, the weight of reality settled over the family. Adjustments required by regulators would limit flexibility, constrain lifestyle, and increase dependence on precise management. The decades-long pursuit of security had evolved into a constant negotiation with uncertainty. Every decision carried amplified stakes, and every choice could influence the trajectory of retirement by years. Financial pressures bled into daily life. Household expenses were meticulously monitored, discretionary spending nearly eliminated, and even small decisions, groceries, utilities, travel, became exercises in risk management. William and Margaret faced the paradox of their existence. Survival demanded discipline, yet discipline exacted a cost in emotional and social well-being. The global economy remained fragile. European debt crises, volatile energy markets, and domestic policy debates introduced new layers of unpredictability. Even with conservative strategies, the Harrisons were exposed. A single policy change or market shock could accelerate depletion, threatening both financial stability and quality of life. Late one evening, another notice arrived from the Oversight Committee. The document, formal and precise, detailed further findings, continued misallocation in previously considered secure accounts, reduced projected returns, and urgent recommendations for restructuring. The implication was clear: immediate action was required, and the window for error had narrowed further. William felt the weight of decades of planning pressing down. Margaret's hand on his arm offered reassurance, but even her composed presence could not erase the stark reality: the family's security, built over decades, was now at risk of rapid deterioration. Tommy, reviewing updated projections, spoke quietly but firmly: "Dad, Mom, we need to act decisively. The next steps will define whether the fund survives or collapses." The family began implementing the new recommendations immediately. Assets were reallocated, previously stable accounts adjusted, and expenditures minimized. Each action was precise, tactical, and designed to preserve the maximum amount of security. Even so, the pace of required adaptation created tension. Mistakes were no longer theoretical, but potentially catastrophic. By 2012, the Harrisons had adapted to a new rhythm. Every day began with updates on markets, regulatory guidance, and fund performance. Afternoons were devoted to work, household management, and scenario simulations. Evenings focused on planning for contingencies, with each member contributing expertise, insight, and diligence. The household operated like a finely tuned machine, though the emotional cost was high. Personal sacrifices were substantial. Vacations remained a distant memory, social engagements were curtailed, and long-term plans for leisure and retirement were indefinitely postponed. The family had learned that security in a volatile system required continuous vigilance, unrelenting discipline, and acceptance of personal constraints. Yet despite rigorous management, uncertainty persisted. Markets remained fragile, policy responses inconsistent, and systemic vulnerabilities continued to manifest. The Harrisons understood that stability was conditional, provisional, and dependent on constant adaptation. Their lifelong pursuit of security had transformed into a daily negotiation with forces beyond their control. Then, in the early months of 2013, the final jolt arrived. A notice from the pension fund administrators revealed previously undisclosed exposure to derivative instruments linked to volatile international markets. The document was precise, procedural, yet its implication was unmistakable. Despite decades of careful planning, regulatory compliance, and proactive management, the family's retirement security remained in jeopardy. William held the letter in silence. Margaret's hand rested on his arm, grounding him. Tommy, reviewing updated projections, finally spoke. "We've managed to slow the worst-case scenario, but this could accelerate losses faster than anything we've seen. We need to prepare for immediate intervention." The gravity of the situation pressed down like a weight over the household. The careful equilibrium the Harrisons had maintained for decades was threatened, not by personal failure, but by systemic forces, regulatory complexity, and market volatility. Each decision now carried amplified stakes, financial, personal, and emotional. Cliffhanger. The camera pans slowly across the living room. Ledgers, laptops, and letters are scattered like battlefield remnants. Outside, the autumn wind sweeps across Maplewood Avenue, scattering leaves and shadows. The phone rings, its tone sharp and insistent. William picks it up, knowing that the voice on the other end could signal guidance, revelation, or the next surge in an unstoppable tide. The Harrison family's carefully constructed world is on the brink, and the next moment could redefine everything. The autumn wind rattled the windows of the Harrison home, carrying with it an almost tangible tension. William sat at the dining table, fingers drumming lightly over the surface as he absorbed the latest projection reports. Each chart, each table, each calculation reflected a reality they had long feared. Despite decades of meticulous planning, disciplined saving, and proactive management, their retirement security remained fragile. The decades of stability were now punctuated by constant uncertainty, and the margin for error had shrunk to almost nothing. Margaret moved quietly around the room, reviewing medical bills, household expenses, and updated projections. Her calm efficiency had become their anchor through these turbulent years, yet even she felt the weight pressing in. Every decision, when to withdraw funds, which assets to liquidate, how to allocate resources, carried consequences that reached beyond finances, touching health, family well-being, and long-term independence. Tommy, seated at his laptop, scrolled through real-time market updates, derivative exposures, and regulatory guidance. "Dad, Mom, we're managing as best we can," he said, voice steady but tense. But the system itself remains unpredictable. Even with perfect execution on our part, market shocks, policy changes, or unexpected expenses could undermine progress. We need contingency strategies ready at a moment's notice. The Harrison family had long accepted that life required planning, discipline, and sacrifice. But the events of the past decade had redefined those principles. Retirement security, once perceived as attainable through diligence and foresight, had become a fragile construct, dependent on forces beyond personal control. The careful equilibrium they had maintained now demanded constant intervention. By late 2013, global markets were slowly stabilizing, yet volatility remained. Interest rates fluctuated, inflationary pressures persisted, and international events created ripple effects that could not be ignored. The Harrisons realized that no portfolio, no matter how conservative, was immune. Every market movement, policy adjustment, or global crisis carried the potential to accelerate the depletion of their retirement funds. Daily life had transformed into a regimented schedule of monitoring, adjusting, and executing financial strategies. William worked extended hours on consulting projects, Margaret balanced tutoring with household management, and Tommy coordinated real-time responses to market fluctuations and regulatory updates. Every day was a careful orchestration, designed to preserve as much security as possible while minimizing exposure to risk. Despite these measures, the human cost was evident. Fatigue etched William's face, tension shadowed Margaret's eyes, and Tommy carried the weight of strategy and emotional mediation. Social activities, leisure, and personal pursuits had been largely abandoned. The family's existence had become a continuous negotiation with uncertainty, where even small errors could carry amplified consequences. In mid-2014, the Oversight Committee issued a new directive. The pension fund, though partially stabilized, was still exposed to high-risk international derivatives and liquidity constraints. Immediate compliance measures were required: asset reallocation, documentation verification, and ongoing reporting. Non-compliance could trigger legal consequences, accelerated depletion, and further constraints on flexibility. William and Margaret responded methodically. They adjusted investments, consolidated accounts, and reviewed every line of projected expense. Tommy ran multiple simulations, stress-testing the portfolio against various economic shocks, regulatory interventions, and personal contingencies. The family's collective expertise, honed through years of necessity, became both their shield and their burden. As the days passed, subtle pressures emerged in personal life. Margaret's health required more frequent monitoring, and medical expenses increased steadily. William's extended work hours created physical and emotional strain. The family's vigilance was not only financial but deeply personal. Survival demanded endurance, focus, and resilience. Each decision carried compounded stakes, affecting both material security and quality of life. By early 2015, small victories began to emerge. Careful asset reallocation, disciplined spending, and proactive monitoring had slowed potential depletion. The fund, though still exposed, had stabilized sufficiently to allow cautious optimism. Yet even these successes were tempered by the recognition that volatility could return without warning. The system that promised stability had revealed its fragility, and the Harrisons remained acutely aware of the ever-present risk. Amid these financial challenges, the family sought emotional equilibrium. Conversations around the dinner table shifted from numbers to resilience, from spreadsheets to shared support. Margaret encouraged William to take brief reprieves, even as they acknowledged the impossibility of full relaxation. Tommy reminded them that survival was a combination of strategy, discipline, and psychological endurance. The family had learned that security was multidimensional. Financial stability could not exist without emotional and physical well-being. Then, in the spring of 2015, another letter arrived from the pension administrators. It was precise, formal, and unyielding. Exposure to complex derivatives required further adjustments, immediate reporting, and verification of all allocations. The message, procedural in tone, carried unambiguous implications. Any delay or miscalculation could accelerate depletion, trigger regulatory action, and compromise decades of planning. William read the letter slowly, feeling the familiar weight pressing down. Margaret placed a hand on his arm, steady and reassuring, while Tommy scanned the contents with professional intensity. The room was silent except for the low hum of the laptop and the distant sounds of the neighborhood. Outside, the wind swept leaves across Maplewood Avenue, a subtle echo of the turbulence in the Harrisons' lives. The family acted immediately. Investments were reviewed, previously stable accounts adjusted, and spending re-examined line by line. Each action required precision, discipline, and coordination. Even a small error could undermine progress, accelerating the depletion of funds and introducing new complications. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on every member of the household. By summer 2015, the Harrisons had established a rhythm of proactive crisis management. Mornings were dedicated to reviewing market updates, regulatory changes, and fund performance. Afternoons involved consulting work, tutoring, and household management. Evenings were reserved for scenario planning, asset reallocation, and expense review. The household operated with the efficiency of a command center, yet the emotional toll remained significant. The family recognized that survival required continuous vigilance. Every decision, financial, personal, or procedural, carried amplified stakes. The careful planning of decades was now entwined with the unpredictability of markets, regulatory oversight, and global events. Stability was provisional, contingent, and fragile, dependent on constant intervention. Then, in August 2015, a new call arrived from the Oversight Committee. William answered, voice steady but alert. The representative outlined newly discovered exposures, potential legal consequences, and required immediate actions to preserve fund viability. The gravity of the situation was clear. Even with disciplined management, decades of security could be undermined in months. William set the phone down, hand trembling slightly. Margaret placed a hand on his shoulder, a gesture of quiet resolve. Tommy reviewed updated projections, the glow of the laptop illuminating a face etched with concentration. The room, filled with ledgers, letters, and screens, felt heavy with decades of accumulated responsibility. The Harrison family had survived countless challenges, yet the forces arrayed against them remained relentless, unpredictable, and unforgiving. The camera pans across the living room. Charts, laptops, letters, and notes form a tableau of decades-long preparation under siege. Outside, the wind sweeps through Maplewood Avenue, scattering leaves across the quiet street. The phone rings again, its tone sharp, insistent, unrelenting. William picks up, knowing that the voice on the other end could signal guidance, revelation, or a new surge in an unstoppable tide. The Harrison family's carefully constructed world teeters on the edge, and the next moment may define whether decades of preparation endure or unravel completely. The late autumn light cast long shadows across the Harrison living room, illuminating the ledgers, letters, and glowing screens that had become constant companions over the past decade. William sat at the head of the table, a quiet determination etched into his face. Margaret moved among the stacks of documents, her hand steady even as her mind weighed the implications of each decision. Tommy scrolled through spreadsheets, projecting outcomes, modeling scenarios, and preparing for contingencies. After years of relentless vigilance, constant recalibration, and personal sacrifice, the family faced a pivotal moment. The pension fund, though battered, had begun to stabilize. Years of proactive management, asset reallocation, expense reduction, and close monitoring of regulatory guidance, had slowed the erosion of security. Yet the system remained fragile, and every choice carried amplified consequences. The Harrisons knew that final resolution would require both precision and courage. The Oversight Committee's most recent communication arrived by courier, a thick envelope of procedural language that masked urgent stakes. Newly discovered exposures in international derivative instruments required immediate action, liquidate high-risk holdings, verify allocations, and implement a detailed compliance plan. The letter emphasized timelines, penalties for delay, and the need for meticulous reporting. The family understood that missteps could undo years of careful planning. William and Margaret reviewed the letter together, line by line, discussing implications, prioritizing actions, and delegating responsibilities. Tommy, seated with a laptop on his knees, ran simulations, stress-testing various courses of action. Each scenario reflected the delicate balance between stabilizing the fund and preserving as much long-term security as possible. Their decisions now would not only determine their financial future but also the emotional and psychological equilibrium of their household. By 2016, the American economic landscape had shifted. Markets were recovering slowly, policy interventions had stabilized credit flows, and regulatory frameworks were adapting to systemic vulnerabilities exposed during the global financial crisis. Yet volatility remained, interest rates fluctuated, and geopolitical uncertainty continued to influence market behavior. For the Harrisons, the environment was cautiously optimistic, but stability remained contingent on careful execution. Margaret, reviewing healthcare projections, realized that personal well-being was as critical as financial management. Medical costs had risen steadily over the years, and health challenges, though manageable, added a layer of urgency to financial decisions. Every dollar preserved or lost had implications for both longevity and quality of life. The family had learned that survival was multidimensional. Financial security could not exist without emotional and physical resilience. William continued consulting, working long hours to generate supplementary income while maintaining oversight of the fund. The physical and emotional toll was evident, yet his discipline and determination provided a model of resilience for the household. Tommy coordinated real-time adjustments, ensuring that each regulatory directive, market fluctuation, and personal expense was accounted for and optimized. Despite these measures, uncertainty remained. Even with careful planning, exposure to external factors, market corrections, policy changes, and global events, could undermine stability. The family had adapted to a life of constant vigilance, yet the psychological strain of perpetual contingency management weighed heavily. Their daily routines were regimented, designed to monitor, respond, and adapt, but each day carried the reminder that systemic forces were unpredictable. In the winter of 2016, a critical turning point arrived. A senior representative from the Oversight Committee scheduled an in-person review of the Harrisons Fund. The meeting would determine compliance status, outline remaining exposures, and provide a roadmap for final stabilization. For the family, this meeting represented both a culmination of years of diligence and the threshold of potential final resolution, or new disruption. The Harrison family prepared meticulously. Margaret organized records, highlighting corrective actions taken over the past decade. William compiled historical statements, demonstrating decades of disciplined contributions and proactive adjustments. Tommy analyzed the most recent projections, identifying risks, mitigation strategies, and contingency measures. The family understood that precision, clarity, and coordination were paramount. The meeting was formal, exacting, and intense. Regulators reviewed allocations, verified adjustments, and assessed compliance. The Harrisons presented their records and demonstrated their proactive strategies. Charts and simulations illustrated risk management, liquidity preservation, and mitigation of potential exposures. Despite the gravity of the situation, the family's decades of diligence were evident. After hours of review, the senior representative spoke, "Your fund remains exposed, but your actions have mitigated the worst-case outcomes. Continued adherence to our recommendations, coupled with prudent management, should stabilize your retirement trajectory. Your diligence has preserved decades of accumulated security." The room released tension slowly. Relief, though tempered by the recognition of remaining systemic risk, washed over the Harrisons. Years of vigilance, sacrifice, and strategic adaptation had reached a turning point. The horizon, once dominated by uncertainty and potential collapse, now offered a cautiously optimistic path forward. Returning home, the family reflected on the journey. The living room, filled with charts, ledgers, and letters, bore witness to years of preparation under siege. The streets outside Maplewood Avenue remained quiet, but the echoes of past turbulence lingered in memory. William, Margaret, and Tommy understood that survival had been achieved not by chance, but through continuous adaptation, discipline, and emotional resilience. Yet even in this moment of relative calm, the family recognized the lessons of systemic vulnerability. Retirement security, long presumed attainable through diligence and foresight, had proven contingent on forces beyond personal control: market volatility, regulatory complexity, and global economic events. The Harrisons' experience was both personal and emblematic, reflecting broader truths about the fragility of financial systems. By 2017, the Harrison household had established a new rhythm. Mornings involved reviewing markets and regulatory updates, afternoons were dedicated to work and strategic adjustments, and evenings focused on family reflection and contingency planning. While the immediate crisis had passed, vigilance remained a necessary aspect of daily life. The family had learned that security was provisional, requiring continuous engagement and adaptation. Personal sacrifices, though substantial, had fostered resilience. Social engagements remained limited, vacations were rare, and long-term leisure plans were postponed. Yet the emotional cohesion of the family strengthened, rooted in shared experience, mutual support, and the understanding that survival required both strategic acumen and collective endurance. Tommy reflected on the journey. "We've stabilized the fund, but the lessons go beyond numbers. Financial security is deeply intertwined with health, relationships, and adaptability. What we've endured isn't just about money, it's about resilience in the face of forces beyond our control." Margaret nodded, placing a hand on William's arm. The weight of the past decade, the uncertainty, sacrifice, and relentless vigilance, had transformed them. They had endured systemic upheaval, navigated regulatory scrutiny, and mitigated financial collapse. The family understood that security, once presumed inherent in structures and systems, required constant attention, foresight, and collective endurance. The living room, a tableau of charts, laptops, letters, and ledgers, remained a testament to decades of preparation and adaptation. Each item bore witness to the meticulous planning, relentless vigilance, and emotional resilience that had allowed the Harrison family to endure. The streets of Maplewood Avenue lay quiet beneath a canopy of winter leaves, a stark contrast to the turbulence they had faced over the years. As the camera lingers on the family, a final phone call interrupts the quiet. The tone is calm but carries weight. William answers, the voice on the other end delivering the last regulatory guidance needed to secure the fund. The room grows still, each member holding their breath. The Harrison family has faced systemic collapse, financial volatility, and personal strain, but the final verdict will determine whether decades of effort endure or unravel in a single moment. The moment is pivotal, fragile, and definitive. The phone call ended with a calm, deliberate assurance. William set it down slowly, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. The voice on the other end, regulatory, precise, and final, had confirmed what the Harrisons had been working toward for over a decade: with continued diligence, careful monitoring, and adherence to recommendations, the fund could sustain itself, preserving the family's retirement security. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her hands folded over the table, absorbing the weight of relief. It was quiet now, yet not the quiet of normalcy, it was the quiet of endurance, of battles fought and survived. Tommy closed his laptop and looked around the room, at the letters, charts, and spreadsheets that had defined their lives for years. They were remnants of struggle, yet symbols of achievement. The family's home, once a site of constant tension, now carried the faint, cautious hum of stability returning. The years since 2008 had tested every assumption they had ever held. Pension systems, financial markets, and regulatory frameworks, once presumed reliable, had revealed vulnerabilities capable of eroding decades of preparation. Yet the Harrisons had adapted, responding to every shift, every shock, and every warning with precision and resolve. Their journey had demanded discipline, resilience, and constant vigilance. The reward was not just financial survival, but a deeper understanding of the fragility of systems they had long trusted implicitly. Winter settled over Maplewood Avenue, snow blanketing the quiet streets, a serene contrast to the turmoil they had endured. Inside, the family gathered around the dining table, reviewing the fund's current position one final time. Every line item, every projected outcome, had been updated, verified, and stress-tested. The narrative of depletion, collapse, and uncertainty that had haunted them for years was finally, cautiously, replaced by the possibility of security and measured optimism. William reflected on the journey aloud. We survived because we acted, adapted, and stayed vigilant. It wasn't luck, it was persistence and preparation. Margaret nodded, her expression a mixture of relief, fatigue, and quiet pride. Tommy spoke softly, we've managed to navigate forces far beyond our control. But the lesson isn't just about money, it's about endurance, foresight, and understanding the systems we rely upon. Even as relief settled, the family understood that systemic risk had not disappeared. Financial markets remained interconnected and volatile, policy adjustments continued to ripple unpredictably, and global events could once again shift conditions in unforeseen ways. Yet the Harrisons had transformed their relationship with uncertainty. What once caused panic now prompted measured action, foresight, and resilience. The household slowly reintroduced normalcy. Meals were shared without spreadsheets, evenings were spent in conversation rather than crisis planning, and small routines regained their place in daily life. Personal sacrifices, though still acknowledged, were offset by the collective sense of accomplishment. They had preserved not only assets but dignity, autonomy, and emotional cohesion. In parallel, the family began educating themselves more broadly about financial systems, regulatory structures, and long-term security strategies. They met with advisors, reviewed policies, and learned to interpret systemic signals that could influence retirement security. The experience had transformed them from passive participants in a presumed stable system to active, informed guardians of their financial future. By 2018, the fund had stabilized sufficiently to allow the Harrisons to cautiously resume deferred plans, minor home renovations, small trips, and long-postponed purchases. Each decision was deliberate, informed by lessons learned over the past decade. The family recognized that even in times of relative stability, prudence and foresight were indispensable. Yet the psychological and emotional scars of the journey remained. William still awoke at night, thinking through projections and potential shocks. Margaret occasionally revisited scenarios in her mind, balancing vigilance with the need for rest. Tommy, now a young adult with his own perspective, internalized lessons of resilience, risk management, and the importance of preparation. The family's shared experiences had created an enduring bond, forged through stress, uncertainty, and triumph. As the years progressed, they embraced a philosophy shaped by experience. Security is neither guaranteed nor permanent, yet it can be actively preserved through diligence, foresight, and adaptability. The Harrisons understood that their story was emblematic. Millions of Americans rely on systems that appear stable but carry hidden vulnerabilities. Awareness, preparation, and proactive engagement were as crucial as the contributions, investments, and planning that underpinned retirement security. The winter of 2019 brought a calm serenity to Maplewood Avenue. Snow lined the quiet streets, the home's windows glowed warmly against the night, and the family gathered for a final review of the fund's projections for the decade. Each figure had been carefully verified, each scenario considered, each contingency prepared. The sense of tension that had dominated their lives for years had softened into cautious confidence. Margaret looked at William and Tommy. "We did it," she said softly, a statement simple yet profound. The weight of years of vigilance, adaptation, and sacrifice hung briefly in the air before dissolving into shared relief. The fund, the home, and their lives had endured systemic shocks that had threatened to undo decades of preparation. Yet through discipline, foresight, and emotional cohesion, they had navigated forces far beyond their control. The family spent the evening reflecting on lessons learned, the importance of continuous monitoring, the value of adaptive strategies, and the necessity of emotional resilience. They recognized that survival in a complex system required more than passive reliance on structures. It demanded active engagement, informed decision-making, and shared responsibility. As night deepened, the living room was quiet, filled with the ambient glow of lamps and the faint hum of a household returning to equilibrium. The charts and ledgers that had once symbolized tension now stood as monuments to endurance. Each item testified to years of vigilance, strategic adjustment, and the preservation of security under extraordinary conditions. The Harrisons had reached a point of relative stability, yet their story concluded not with naive certainty but with measured awareness. Systems, markets, and institutions remained vulnerable, but the family had cultivated the knowledge, discipline, and resilience to navigate future challenges. Their experience was both deeply personal and emblematic of a larger truth. In a world of systemic complexity, preparation, foresight, and collective endurance are the keys to survival. The camera pans slowly across the living room. Ledgers, charts, and laptops now lie in quiet order. Outside, snow drifts silently along Maplewood Avenue, undisturbed, a stark contrast to the turbulence of years past. William, Margaret, and Tommy sit together, a family forged through adversity, strengthened by resilience, and united by shared experience. Decades of careful planning, sacrifice, and vigilance have culminated in stability, yet the memory of uncertainty endures as a quiet reminder of the fragility of systems once presumed reliable. The camera lingers over the Harrisons' quiet home, snow settling gently outside, a serene contrast to the turmoil of years past. Inside, ledgers, charts, and screens lie still, symbols of vigilance, discipline, and endurance. The family sits together, a tableau of resilience forged through uncertainty, adaptation, and shared determination. Their story, though deeply personal, reflects a universal truth: the systems we rely upon, financial, social, institutional, carry hidden vulnerabilities, and the path to security is rarely straightforward. Stability is not granted by default, it is cultivated through foresight, diligence, and the courage to confront forces beyond individual control. Through the years, the Harrisons learned that survival requires more than calculation. It demands emotional resilience, collaboration, and the willingness to adapt at every turn. Every decision carried weight, every day held consequences, yet through persistence and care, they navigated crises that might have unmade them. As the camera pans across Maplewood Avenue, now quiet under the soft light of early evening, the message becomes clear: life's systems are complex, unpredictable, and sometimes unforgiving. But preparation, awareness, and collective endurance can preserve not only security, but dignity, independence, and hope. The Harrisons' journey ends not with triumph over every risk, but with mastery over what they could control, a testament to the human capacity to endure, adapt, and persevere. Their story remains a quiet, reflective reminder: in a world of uncertainty, vigilance and resilience are the true currency of survival.